You have been trying to master yourself your whole life. Let me say that again. You have been trying to master yourself your whole life. And somewhere along the way, you started to believe that mastery meant becoming harder, colder, more controlled. A version of you with no cracks in the armor, no wasted minutes, no soft edges left to exploit. You've read the books. You've watched the interviews. You've written the 5 a.m. wake-up rule on a sticky note and stuck it to a mirror that has seen you fail to follow it more mornings than not. And some quiet part of you has started to wonder if the problem is that you simply don't have what it takes. Maybe you've bought the planner with the color-coded tabs. Maybe you've downloaded the app that tracks your streaks, watched it climb, watched it break, and felt something in your chest sink a little further each time the counter reset to 0. Maybe you've told yourself, quietly, in the space between one failed attempt and the next, that other people were simply built with something you weren't. Before you go any further down that road, I want you to hear something clearly, because it is going to change the way you listen to everything that follows. The mastery you were sold is not the mastery that works. What you were given was a costume, a performance, a tightly disciplined mask built out of other people's routines, other people's willpower, other people's definitions of what a high performer is supposed to look like from the outside. And you have been trying to wear that costume for years, wondering why it keeps slipping off in the moments that matter most. This is not another list of habits. This is not a hustle script dressed up in calm music. This is an immersive resource built for identity-level reconstruction, for quietly, patiently rebuilding the internal architecture that real, sustainable mastery is actually built on, not performance, not control, something else entirely, something you already sense but have never had named for you. Think of this hour less as a lecture and more as a slow walk back to something you already own. Nobody is going to hand you a new personality by the end of this. Nobody is going to hand you a 10-step morning routine copied from a stranger's highlight reel. What you're going to get instead is quieter and, frankly, more useful. A way of seeing your own life clearly enough that the right actions stop requiring so much force. By the end of this, you will understand why the discipline that never sticks was never really discipline at all. You will understand why the version of mastery you've been chasing was designed to keep you exhausted, not free. And you will meet a framework of 4 quiet pillars that will give you a new, working definition of what it actually means to govern yourself. Settle in. Let the noise of the day fall away for the next hour. What follows isn't going to ask you to become someone else. It's going to ask you to finally stop performing and start listening to who you've been the whole time. Consider, for a moment, why this particular hour might matter more than the last 10 self-improvement videos you watched. Most of what circulates online about discipline was built to be consumed in 90 seconds, a hook, a routine, a call to action, gone before it ever had the chance to actually change anything structural in you. An idea that arrives in 90 seconds rarely survives past the 90 seconds that follow it. What you're doing right now is different simply by virtue of its shape. You are giving one idea an hour of your undivided attention, and that alone is a kind of governance most people never practice anymore. There is no test at the end of this. No checklist to print out and fail at by Thursday. What there is instead is a slow argument built chapter by chapter for a completely different way of relating to your own effort. If you've spent years feeling like the problem was always you, some missing gene for consistency that other people seem to have been born with, I'd ask you to hold that belief loosely for the next hour. Not because I'm asking you to believe something flattering, because the belief you've been carrying was built on a faulty premise, and faulty premises produce faulty conclusions about who you are, no matter how carefully you reason from them. 5 chapters stand between here and the end of this hour. The first dismantles the version of discipline you were sold. The second uncovers what actually sits underneath lasting change. The third names 4 quiet operating principles you'll carry with you long after this recording ends. The fourth walks through what those principles look like on an ordinary day, in ordinary rooms, with nobody watching. And the fifth brings all of it home to something you likely suspected long before you pressed play. Nothing here requires you to take notes. Let the ideas move through you the way a long walk moves through you, not memorized, just absorbed. Chapter 1. The myth you were sold about mastery discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment, Jim Rohn used to tell audiences decades ago, and he was right. But somewhere between his stage and your algorithm feed, that idea got distorted into something almost unrecognizable. Picture a man in his early 30s, phone propped against a water bottle, filming his morning routine for an audience of strangers. Cold plunge. 50 push-ups before his eyes are fully open. A green smoothie he grimaces through on camera. He calls it discipline. What the camera doesn't show is the 3 hours later that night when he can't sleep, wired and hollow, wondering why none of it feels like progress. That is the myth. Mastery is performance. Mastery is something you display rather than something you are. Is it any wonder you feel like you're failing? You were never given a broken definition of success. You were given a broken definition of the person success is supposed to happen to. Here is the quiet, uncomfortable truth. Most of what gets marketed as self-mastery is actually just self-suppression. It's willpower spent white-knuckling your way through a life that doesn't match who you actually are, hoping the friction will eventually feel like strength. Research on willpower and self-control consistently suggests that this approach has a ceiling. Psychologists studying self-regulation have found that willpower behaves less like an unlimited resource and more like a muscle that fatigues under sustained strain. Which is part of why forced discipline collapses the moment stress rises. Think of a woman standing in her kitchen at 9 p.m., staring at a habit tracker taped to the fridge, every square for the last 4 days left empty. She isn't lazy. She isn't weak. She built a system that required her to become someone else for 2 hours a day. And no system survives that kind of internal civil war for long. What if the discipline that keeps collapsing was never actually yours to begin with? There's a pattern worth naming here that shows up across almost every version of this story, regardless of the specific routine involved. It usually starts with genuine motivation, a real desire to change, sparked by something honest, a health scare, a missed opportunity, a quiet dissatisfaction that finally got loud enough to act on. That motivation gets funneled almost immediately into whatever discipline performance happens to be trending at the time, because that's the only template most people have ever been shown. The genuine desire was never the problem. The borrowed template was. Consider, too, how much of the modern self-improvement economy runs on borrowed intensity. A stranger online wakes up at 4:30, And within a week, thousands of people are setting alarms for 4:30. Not because it fits their chronotype, their job, their family, or their actual energy patterns, but because intensity has been mistaken for evidence. The louder a routine looks, the more convincing it seems, and the less anyone stops to ask whether it was ever designed for a life like theirs. Earl Nightingale spent much of his career pointing at a simpler truth than the hustle culture version of success ever wanted to admit. That we become what we think about consistently over time. Not what we force, not what we perform, what we believe ourselves to be, repeated quietly enough, long enough, that it becomes structural. That is the first crack in the myth. Mastery was never supposed to be a performance for an audience, imagined or real. It was supposed to be a private, internal governance so consistent that it no longer requires applause to sustain itself. Here's a second scene. A young entrepreneur, 18 months into building something real, sitting across from a mentor who has actually built 3 companies, not just talked about building one. The entrepreneur says, "I just need more discipline." The mentor pauses and says quietly, "No, you need a better reason to still be you when no one's watching. That line will matter more by the end of this than it does right now." There's a third scene worth sitting with, quieter still. A student, weeks from a final exam, has color-coded her entire semester into a spreadsheet, study blocks, revision cycles, sleep windows, all of it optimized to a level that would impress a productivity consultant. And yet, 3 weeks in, she's studying less than she was before the spreadsheet existed, because the system itself has become the thing she's managing rather than the subject she actually needs to learn. The performance of organization quietly replaced the substance of the work. The version of mastery sold to you was never designed to make you free. It was designed to make you tired in a way that looks productive on camera. And the exhaustion you've been carrying, the one you've quietly blamed on your own lack of willpower, that exhaustion is not evidence that you're broken. It's evidence that you are solving the wrong problem with the wrong tool. And here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. You were never actually competing with those routines you saw online. You were competing with an edited, curated 3-minute highlight of somebody else's hardest and best days, stitched together to look like an average Tuesday. No one shows the version of themselves who hit snooze 4 times. No one shows the version who skipped the gym because their kid was sick, or the meeting ran long, or they simply didn't have it in them that day. You've been measuring your unedited life against someone else's highlight reel and calling the gap between them a personal failure. It was never a fair comparison to begin with. There's a particular kind of shame that grows out of this comparison, and it's worth naming directly, because shame left unnamed tends to steer decisions from somewhere underneath conscious thought. When the performance version of discipline collapses, and it always eventually collapses, because it was never built for your actual life, the mind doesn't usually conclude that system was flawed. It concludes, I am flawed. That single substitution, quiet and almost instant, is where years of unnecessary suffering get manufactured. The system fails, and the self absorbs the blame that belonged to the system. Think of a father who tried for exactly 9 days to wake at 5 and meditate for 20 minutes before his children stirred. On day 10, one of them had a fever in the night, and the routine broke. What followed wasn't a calm recalibration. It was a familiar, punishing inner voice telling him he'd proven once again, that he simply didn't have what disciplined people have. Nobody stopped to ask whether a rigid 20-minute block was ever a reasonable structure for a household with 2 small children and unpredictable nights. The routine was the flawed variable. The self absorbed the failure anyway. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes something that might otherwise sound abstract. The myth of performance discipline doesn't just waste your time. It actively manufactures false evidence against your own character, one broken streak at a time, and then asks you to use that false evidence to decide who you're allowed to become. There's an economic dimension to this myth that's worth naming plainly, because it changes how you might choose to consume content like this one going forward. An audience that feels perpetually behind, perpetually one purchase or one program away from finally becoming disciplined, is an audience that keeps buying. A calm, self-governed person who trusts their own quiet consistency is, from a purely commercial standpoint, a worse customer. That doesn't mean every course or book on discipline is cynical or without value many genuinely help. But it's worth holding a small, healthy skepticism toward any message whose core emotional engine is you are currently failing, and only this next thing will fix it. That engine runs on manufactured urgency, and manufactured urgency, almost by definition, cannot be sustained without eventually costing you something. Consider finally a simple thought experiment before we move forward. Imagine 2 versions of the same person 5 years from now. One spent those 5 years chasing an ever-escalating performance of discipline, more extreme routines, more visible proof, more comparison to whoever the loudest voice in their feed happened to be that year. The other spent those 5 years slowly, quietly governing a small, honest set of decisions that actually matched who they were. Neither life is guaranteed to look more impressive from the outside on any given Tuesday, but only one of those 5 years is sustainable enough to still be standing unbroken on year 6. That's the version of mastery this hour is actually about. Chapter 2. The identity beneath the discipline. What if you've had the order backwards this entire time? Most people are taught that action creates results, and enough results eventually convince you that you're the kind of person who achieves things. Discipline first, identity later, a slow, grinding proof of work you perform until the evidence piles up high enough to believe in yourself. But there's a large, growing body of behavioral research that says the arrow points the other direction far more powerfully than we've been told. James Clear's work on habit formation makes a case that has quietly reshaped how modern psychology talks about change, that the most durable behaviors aren't built by willpower at all, they're built by identity. You don't floss because flossing is virtuous. You floss because somewhere along the way, a person who takes care of their health became a true sentence about who you are. And the behavior simply followed the belief. Carol Dweck's research on mindset takes this even further. Her studies distinguish between people who see their abilities as fixed traits and people who see them as capacities that develop, and the second group doesn't just perform better under difficulty, they interpret difficulty itself differently, treating a setback as information rather than a verdict. That distinction isn't cosmetic. It's the difference between a person who quits at the first sign of struggle and a person who barely registers the struggle as a threat to who they are. Picture a man alone in his apartment at 11:40 p.m., laptop open, staring at a half-written self-description for a professional bio he's been avoiding for weeks. He types aspiring, deletes it. Types trying to become, deletes that too. He sits there for a long moment, then finally writes, "I build things that matter," and closes the laptop before he can talk himself out of it. Nothing about his circumstances changed in that moment. Something about his identity just quietly did. That is not a small thing. That is the actual mechanism. You cannot discipline your way into becoming someone you have not first, even privately, decided you already are. It's worth pausing here to notice how differently this reframes failure itself. In the old model action first, identity is a distant reward. Every stumble is evidence against you. Another data point in the case that you simply aren't the kind of person who follows through. In the identity first model, a stumble means something entirely different. It means the old identity briefly reasserted itself, the way an old habit of speech slips back in around family even after years of change. It's not proof the new identity was false. It's proof the old one hasn't fully finished dissolving yet, which is simply what happens on the way to almost anything durable. There's a useful distinction buried in behavioral psychology between outcome-based change and identity-based change. Outcome-based change says, I want to run a marathon, so I will force myself to run, and eventually I will become a runner. Identity-based change flips the sequence entirely. I am someone who moves their body every day. So running becomes one of the natural expressions of that belief, not a punishment imposed on top of it. The first version is exhausting because it treats the goal as separate from the self. The second version is sustainable because the goal is simply what that self does. Here's another scene, smaller and quieter. A woman on a Tuesday afternoon, closing her laptop 15 minutes early to go for a walk instead of squeezing in one more task, not because a productivity app told her to, but because somewhere in the last few months she stopped thinking of rest as something she had to earn. She thinks of herself now as someone who protects her own mind. The walk isn't discipline. The walk is just what a person with that identity naturally does. Consider, too, a small but telling moment in a grocery store, a man reaching for the cart, pausing for half a second longer at the produce aisle than he used to. Not because he's counting anything or punishing himself for a past meal, but because somewhere along the way I take care of my body quietly became true about him. And the produce aisle is simply where that belief shows up first. Nobody in that store could tell the difference between him and someone forcing themselves through a diet. But internally, the two men are doing completely different things. This is where the myth from Chapter 1 fully collapses. The exhausted performer, the one white-knuckling routines that don't match who they are, that exhaustion exists because identity and action were pointed in opposite directions. You cannot sustainably act your way into a self you don't privately believe. And you cannot fake believe your way into it either. It has to be built deliberately the way you'd build anything that needs to hold weight. It's worth naming, too, that identity isn't fixed the way a birth certificate is fixed. It is closer to a story you are continuously telling yourself, one small piece of evidence at a time. Every action either confirms the story or quietly contradicts it. Skip the workout once, and it means very little. Skip it while telling yourself, that's just not who I am anymore. And you've done something far more damaging than missing a single session when you've edited the story itself. So here is the question worth sitting with before the next chapter. If your actions are just downstream evidence of who you've quietly decided you are, who exactly have you been deciding to be? There's a practical implication buried in all of this that's easy to miss on a first pass. If identity really does come first, then the most productive question most people ask is, what should I do differently? Is often the wrong starting question entirely. The more useful, if less comfortable, question is, what have I quietly decided is true about myself? And is it actually true? Or is it just old evidence I never bothered to re-examine? Consider a woman who has spent a decade privately believing she's not a disciplined person. An identity she formed in her 20s around a handful of unfinished projects and broken resolutions. She has since built a career, raised 2 children largely on her own, and managed a household through several genuine crises without ever missing a beat of undeniable evidence of exactly the kind of consistency she claims not to have. But the old identity, formed early and never revisited, still runs quietly in the background, coloring how she interprets every new goal she sets. She isn't undisciplined. She's just been reading new evidence through an outdated file. This is, in a sense, the real work beneath the 4 pillars we're about to name, not just building a new identity from scratch, but going back and correcting the false one that got installed years ago. Often before you were even old enough to consciously evaluate whether it was accurate. It's worth adding a note of realism here, because identity work can easily be oversold as a kind of magic trick to decide you're a runner, and suddenly running feels effortless. That isn't quite how it works, and promising otherwise would be its own small dishonesty. Identity shifts don't erase resistance. The alarm still feels heavy at 6 a.m. The harder conversation still makes your stomach tighten before you have it. What identity actually changes is the story you tell yourself about that resistance in the moment it shows up. The old story says, this resistance proves I'm not really the kind of person who does this. The new story says, this resistance is simply what it feels like when a person who does this anyway is about to do it again. Same discomfort. There is a completely different meaning attached to it. There's a second, quieter layer to identity work worth naming before we move into the 4 pillars. Identity isn't just built through big declarations, I am a disciplined person, said once with conviction. It's built, more often, through the small, almost invisible language you use with yourself in passing. The way you talk about yourself to a friend when you cancel plans. The way you narrate a mistake in your own head half a second after making it. Every one of those small throwaway narrations is either quietly reinforcing an identity or quietly undermining one, whether or not you ever notice it happening. Chapter 3. The 4 pillars of quiet mastery we are what we repeatedly do is a line often attributed to ancient philosophy, and whatever its true origin, it survives because it's structurally correct. But repetition alone isn't the mechanism. Repetition without direction just produces well-practiced chaos. What separates a person who is quietly, sustainably mastering their life from a person who is just busy is architecture. So let's name it. There are 4 pillars beneath everything we've discussed so far, 4 quiet, unglamorous operating principles that together form what I'll call the 4 pillars of quiet mastery. Not a slogan. A working structure you can actually hold on to and return to, chapter after chapter, decision after decision. The first pillar is awareness. the simple, radical act of noticing your own patterns without immediately judging them. Most people move through their days on autopilot, reacting to old scripts written by old versions of themselves, never pausing long enough to ask whether the script still fits. Awareness is the pause before the reaction. Picture a man about to send a sharp reply to a colleague's email, cursor hovering over send, who suddenly notices the tightness in his own chest and thinks this isn't about the email and closes the laptop instead. That noticing, that half-second of separation between impulse and action, is the entire pillar in miniature. Awareness isn't about becoming hypercritical of yourself, cataloguing every flaw like an accountant auditing a failing business. It's closer to becoming a curious observer of your own mind, watching the pattern arrive, naming it quietly, and only then deciding whether it still deserves your obedience. Most people skip that middle step entirely. They feel the old script activate, and they simply follow it the way water follows a groove worn deep into stone. Awareness is what interrupts the groove long enough for a different path to even become visible. Rhetorical question worth sitting with: how much of your life has been reaction dressed up as decision? Letting go of the control illusion stands as the second pillar. Here is something uncomfortable. A meaningful amount of what people call discipline is actually just an attempt to control outcomes that were never controllable to begin with. Outcomes depend on timing, other people, markets, luck, circumstance. What you actually govern is much smaller and much more powerful: your attention, your effort, your response. A founder who spent 2 years trying to control how fast her company grew finally let go of the timeline entirely and redirected all that same energy into the quality of what she was building each week. The company didn't slow down. It sped up, because the energy was no longer being burned fighting the uncontrollable. There's a subtle grief buried inside this pillar that doesn't get talked about enough. Letting go of the control illusion means accepting that some of your hardest work may never be rewarded on the timeline you wanted, by the people you wanted, in the shape you imagined. That's not failure. That's simply the nature of a world with more moving parts than any one person can command. Peace doesn't come from controlling more. It comes from finally putting down the parts that were never yours to hold. Identity design is the third pillar, and you've already met it. This is Chapter 2's discovery. Formalized, deliberately, consciously choosing who you are becoming, sentence by sentence, rather than letting circumstance write that identity for you by default. This pillar asks a simple, ongoing question, one you can return to in almost any situation. What would the person I'm choosing to become do right now? Not what would impress anyone watching. Not what would look disciplined on camera. What would that quiet, self-governed version of you actually do? If no one ever found out either way. Governance of small moments completes the recognition that mastery is never demonstrated in the big cinematic decision. It's demonstrated in the 6,000 small ones nobody's watching. The extra 10 minutes at the desk when you're tired, the declined invitation that would have cost you your morning, the paused breath before the reactive text message. Research into habit formation offers a useful, humbling data point here. A well-known study on habit automaticity found that new behaviors took a median of roughly 2 months of repetition before they became close to automatic, and for some behaviors, considerably longer. Mastery, in other words, is not an event. It is a median. It is the accumulation of unremarkable Tuesdays. Notice, before we walk through each one individually, that these 4 pillars weren't chosen arbitrarily out of a longer list of possible virtues. They were chosen because together they cover the entire terrain of a single decision: what you notice, what you accept you can't control, who you're choosing to be in response, and what you actually do about it in the smallest, least observed instant available. Miss any one of the 4, and the structure quietly fails. Awareness without identity design just produces insight with nowhere to go. Identity design without governance of small moments just produces a nice idea about yourself that never becomes true. The 4 only work as a set. Notice how the 4 pillars actually build on one another rather than sitting side by side as separate tips. Awareness is what lets you see the pattern clearly enough to interrupt it. Letting go of the control illusion is what frees the energy you were previously wasting on the uncontrollable. Identity design is what redirects freed energy toward a chosen direction instead of a default one. And governance of small moments is simply where all 3 of the others get tested over and over in rooms nobody else will ever see. Say the 4 pillars again, slowly, because you'll need them later. Awareness. Letting go of the control illusion. Identity design. Governance of small moments. It's worth being honest about what these 4 pillars will not do. They will not make your circumstances easier. They will not remove the difficult boss, the tight finances, the health scare, the grief that arrives without warning. What they change is something quieter and, over time, more decisive. How much of your limited energy gets burned reacting to what you can't touch versus invested in what you actually govern? 2 people can face the exact same difficult year. One spends it exhausted by everything outside their control. The other spends it, imperfectly but consistently, tending to the small handful of things that were always theirs to tend. By the end of that year, their circumstances might look identical from the outside. Internally, they are nowhere close to the same. There's also a common misreading of this framework worth heading off early. None of the 4 pillars ask you to feel less. Awareness isn't detachment. Letting go of the control illusion isn't resignation. This isn't a framework for numbing yourself into calm compliance with whatever happens. It's a framework for directing real feeling, real ambition, real care toward the places where they can actually do something instead of letting all of that energy scatter uselessly across everything you were never going to be able to change anyway. This is not a personality transplant. It is a structure of 4 hooks you can hang every decision on, starting today, starting with the very next small moment that presents itself to you. It might help to picture the 4 pillars less as 4 separate rooms and more as 4 questions you carry into every room you already enter. Walking into a difficult meeting, what am I noticing right now? Before I react, that's awareness. Sitting with a result that didn't go your way, what here was actually mine to control, and what wasn't that's letting go of the control illusion. Choosing how to respond to a friend's request, a stranger's criticism, your own fatigue. What would the person I'm becoming do here? That's identity design. And underneath all 3, quietly in whatever small moment you happen to be standing in right now, is this the version of the decision I'll be proud of in a year? Even though no one will ever know I made it. That's governance of small moments. None of these 4 questions require special circumstances to practice. They don't require a retreat, a reset, a new year, or a Monday. They're available in the very next ordinary moment of your very ordinary day, which is, in the end, the entire point of calling this quiet mastery rather than dramatic transformation. Dramatic transformation waits for the right conditions. Quiet mastery simply starts wherever you happen to be standing. Chapter 5. The return to what you already knew. Here's what nobody tells you at the start of a journey like this. The destination was never a new person. Let me say that again. The destination was never a new person. You did not need to be rebuilt into someone harder, colder, more controlled. You needed to strip away the costume, the performance discipline, the borrowed routines, the exhausting theater of hustle, and find the person who was quietly there underneath the entire time, waiting to be governed rather than replaced. Think back to the very first image in this audiobook, the man filming his cold plunge morning routine for an audience of strangers, hollow and wired by midnight. Now picture him again, months later, phone left in another room, doing the unremarkable version of that same morning, not for anyone, not performing anything, simply because it's who he's decided to be. The routine looks almost identical from the outside. Internally, it is an entirely different act. That is the hidden truth this entire audiobook has been building toward. Self-mastery was never about becoming someone you are not. It was about finally, quietly, taking command of who you already were, governing the self that existed long before the productivity culture handed you a costume and told you it was growth. Picture, one more time, every scene this audiobook has walked you through. The man closing the laptop instead of sending the sharp reply. The founder releasing a timeline that was never hers to control. The father choosing 15 undistracted minutes over a scrolling phone. The woman who finally believed her own word to herself. None of them became someone new in those moments. Every one of them simply stopped performing long enough to let who they already were make the decision instead. There's a kind of quiet relief available here if you let yourself actually feel it. You are not behind. You were never behind. You were simply pouring real effort into the wrong container, into a costume that was never built to fit the specific, particular shape of your one life. The moment you stop trying to force yourself into someone else's discipline and start governing the person you actually are, the exhaustion you've been carrying for years has somewhere to finally set itself down. It's worth being honest, too, about how long this return actually takes for most people, because false expectations here can quietly undo everything this hour has built. This isn't a single insight that permanently rewires you the moment you finish listening. The old performance identity, the one built out of borrowed routines and manufactured urgency, has usually had years, sometimes decades, to root itself in. It will not politely exit the moment you understand, intellectually, that it was never serving you. It will show up again in familiar disguises on ordinary Tuesdays for longer than feels fair. The work isn't defeating it once. The work is simply noticing it, calmly every time it returns, and quietly choosing the 4 pillars again for as many Tuesdays as it takes. Return one final time to the 4 quiet pillars because they are what remains once the performance falls away. Awareness. Letting go of the control illusion. Identity design. Governance of small moments. Not a personality, a practice. Something you return to imperfectly for the rest of your life, not a summit you reach once and photograph. Earl Nightingale's old idea holds the whole thing together. You become what you think about, not what you force, not what you perform for an audience, real or imagined. What you quietly, repeatedly, privately decide is true about who you are, until one day the decision stops feeling like effort and simply feels like you. You already knew this. Somewhere underneath the noise, the sticky notes, the routines borrowed from strangers on a screen, you already knew that the loudest version of discipline was never going to be the one that lasted. This was never new information. This was a return. It's worth noticing, too, what actually happens to ambition once it stops being fueled by performance. It doesn't disappear. If anything, it becomes more precise. A person governed by these 4 pillars still wants things, still builds, still reaches, still pushes toward difficult goals. What changes is the fuel underneath the wanting. It's no longer borrowed intensity, urgency manufactured by comparison, or the fear of being seen as someone who isn't trying hard enough. It's something steadier, a private, unhurried conviction that this is simply who they've decided to be, and the work is just what that person does, day after unremarkable day. Hashtag soft closing. If you take nothing else from the last hour, take this. Mastery was never meant to be loud. It was never meant to be filmed, performed, or proven to anyone standing outside your own quiet room at 6:15 in the morning. It was meant to be governed, gently, consistently, privately, by the 4 pillars you now carry with you. Awareness, letting go of what was never yours to control. Designing, deliberately, who you're becoming. And honoring the thousands of small, unwitnessed moments that no one will ever applaud, but that quietly decide everything. You don't need a harder version of yourself. You never did. You need to keep returning, tomorrow morning and the morning after that and the one after that, to the self that was always capable of this, long before anyone sold you a costume and called it growth. There will be mornings you get it wrong. There will be small moments you fail to govern, old patterns that pull you back into the performance you're trying to leave behind. That's not proof this doesn't work. That's simply what practice looks like, in any domain, for any person who has ever built something real. The goal was never a flawless record. It was a direction, one you keep quietly choosing, one unremarkable Tuesday at a time. And on the mornings it does go wrong, resist the urge to reach for a harsher version of yourself as the fix. That reach is exactly the old costume, offering itself again, disguised as motivation. The 4 pillars don't ask for a harsher self. They ask for a more honest one, aware enough to notice the slip, humble enough to let go of demanding a perfect record, clear enough about who you're becoming to simply begin again, quietly, in whatever small moment happens to be next. If there's one thing worth carrying out of this room and into the rest of your week, let it be this. You were never actually behind the people you've been comparing yourself to. You were simply using their map to navigate a life they never lived. Put that map down, draw your own, slowly, from the 4 quiet pillars you now carry, and trust that a life built this way, unglamorous and unwitnessed as it may look from the outside, is exactly the kind of life that lasts. Before you go, take one unhurried moment to picture tomorrow morning. Not a perfect version of it. Not a version filmed for anyone. Just the ordinary shape of it, however it actually looks for you. Whatever room you'll wake up in. Whatever the first small decision in front of you happens to be. You don't need to plan it out in detail right now. You simply need to know that when it arrives, you'll have 4 quiet questions available to you that weren't available this time yesterday. That's not nothing. Over enough ordinary mornings, that's actually everything. Thank you for spending this hour in a quieter kind of ambition. If this found you at the right moment, let it sit with you tonight rather than rushing on to the next thing. And if you'd like to return to this room again, we'll be here, still speaking slowly, still building the same kind of mind, one honest hour at a time.